Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Charlie Taylor from KDLA, one of the CE consultants, and I'd like to welcome you all to a great topic, disability etiquette. Just going to do a little bit of housekeeping before I turn the presentation over to our presenters. You'll see in the bottom left-hand corner there is a downloads pod where you can go ahead and grab some downloads now if you want, or you can wait until the end of the webinar. We do have the PDF available, which is the full-size version of the slides. We also have the handout available that was sent out in the email earlier today. You can grab those now, or like I said, wait until the end. And while I'm talking, you'll also see a poll there in the bottom portion of the screen. Go ahead and feel free to let us know how you feel about your disability etiquette skills as they are before the webinar. If you have any questions for our presenters today, they're hoping that this is going to be an interactive session, and so am I, hoping this is an opportunity for good conversation about this topic for everybody. So please feel free to use the chat pod for your questions, comments. I didn't know that, things like that. Whatever you think about what they're saying, they're going to be watching that chat pod for your questions. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, chat those in, and I'll be here to take care of those. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our archived webinars page within about a week's time, hopefully sooner than that, but you'll be able to come back and review anything you've heard or share it with any of your coworkers at that time who might have missed it. So I think that's everything. It looks like for our poll, it looks like everybody feels pretty comfortable with their disability etiquette skills, just hopefully here to learn some new tips, some things maybe you didn't know. That's awesome. I'm glad you guys feel comfortable. I'm going to change the screen over to our sort of traditional webinar format. Okay, and I'm going to mute my phone and turn it over to Melanie and Lindsay, our presenters for today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Melanie. And I'm Lindsay. And thank you for joining us for our disability etiquette training. I know it kind of sounds like something that might be kind of dry and boring, but we're going to do our best to make it as fun and enjoyable for you guys as we can. So we're both independent living specialists from the Center for Accessible Living, and we are what's called a Center for Independent Living, or CIL for short. We're community-based, but agencies like ours are nationwide. We have 403 across the United States, and our consumers control our services. So basically the services that we provide and the way we provide them is all determined by the people that we work with and what they need. And we're operated for and by people with disabilities. So we are federally mandated to have at least 51% of our staff and board of directors have to be people with disabilities. And if you work for us or you're on our board and you don't have a disability, then you work very closely or are very close with someone who does. We work off the IL philosophy, independent living philosophy, which is people with disabilities have the right to make their own choices, live life the way they want, and have the same opportunities and access to their communities as people without disabilities. So we want people with disabilities to be out there and live in the world, access their world, and achieve, whatever goals they have. So we provide core services and much more, including this disability etiquette training, which is one of our core services is advocacy. So this is kind of an advocacy effort on our part to help society become more comfortable interacting with people with disabilities.
Yeah, and we usually try to give a disclaimer here, like obviously in a world where everyone gets offended by a lot of things, we're not here to be the police of political correctness.
Right.
We're just here to educate you, because a lot of times when it comes to interacting with people with disabilities, it's just a matter of not knowing the right way to interact with them, not knowing the respectful way to interact with people with disabilities. So we're not here to shove a bunch of lingo down your throats or make you feel bad about past interactions that you've had with people with disabilities. We just want to educate you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I always like to start a quote by a Dr. Adolf Radska. Thank you. Who is a person with a disability and a lifelong disability advocate. Independent living does not mean that we want to do everything by ourselves. We do not need anybody or like to live in isolation. Independent living means that we demand the same choices and control in our everyday lives that our non-disabled brothers and sisters, neighbors and friends take for granted. We want to grow up in our families, go to the neighborhood school, use the same bus as our neighbors, work in jobs that are in line with our education and interests, and raise families of our own. We are profoundly ordinary people sharing the same need to feel included, recognized, and loved. And I just really love that quote because that just shows that people with disabilities, we just want to be part of society like everyone else because we are like everyone else.
Right. So our mission is we want to be an innovative leader in empowering all people to achieve their goal of independent living and involve the entire community. We're not saying that all people with disabilities should live independently and get no help from anyone, but we want to help people in our community learn the skills to overcome barriers that prevent them from interacting in the community like you or I. For example, we'll teach people how to ride the Go Bus here in Bowling Green so that they can get places they want to go. Maybe we would bring someone to your library and show them how to sign up for a library card or check out books or even how to appropriately interact or behave in a library. So it is a learning process on their end as well, but it's a community effort. It's not something that we can just teach our consumers and no one else has to do anything. We need the whole community working together to include them and to accept them and give them equal access to the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we start off with the question, what is the disability? I think a lot of people not familiar with disabilities or much experience around people with disabilities might strictly think that it's just strictly a diagnosis. But one of the things that it is a physical or mental condition that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So when you're living day to day, if there's something that you struggle with, which would be considered a normal daily activity or function, if you struggle with that, then you have a disability.
And under the ADA, some things that would qualify for that major life activity could be self-care tasks, manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, communicating, and working. So if there's any kind of impairment to any of those tasks, no matter how simple, then that condition would be covered under the ADA.
Okay, another thing, people who have a record of an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. So maybe at one time someone had an illness or a physical injury that rendered them temporarily disabled, but they've healed or overcome that. That person still had a disability.
Maybe, for example, you've had cancer in the past and you're in remission. You still went through that process, and that's part of your medical history and your medical chart, but you don't have any conditions or impairments right now. That would still be covered.
Individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded as having a disability. Some examples of this could be if someone has maybe a cleft lip, or if someone has a birthmark that takes up a big portion of their face, that person, it doesn't affect their major life activity or the daily functions of their life, but society perceives them as having a disability, so they might experience discrimination and have a hard time in their day-to-day lives. And people who rely on medication or devices to function effectively in their lives are also considered to have a disability.
Yeah, and this one is kind of tricky because obviously we don't know who is able to function in their daily life with or without medication or devices. But think of it, if you have someone who has trouble breathing and they carry an oxygen tank, if they didn't have that oxygen with them, they obviously couldn't breathe. If someone didn't have their diabetic medication, they would have some impairments, obviously. So this one was kind of a new one for me coming into this field because I thought, oh, we take medication or we have these devices or whatever, and so that makes them typical, like everyone else. But we do need to remember that those are just assistive technology, assistive medications to help them cope with the day-to-day impairments that might come along with their disability.
Okay, did you know that people with disabilities are the country's largest minority group? 1 in every 5 Americans have a disability. People with disabilities can be of all ages, ethnicities, genders, sexual orientations, religions, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So we say that anyone can join this group at any time.
We don't discriminate. We'll take anyone. And seeing a few questions coming in, definitely mental illness, and we'll have a little section just about mental illness. But yes, antidepressants, medication, because if you did not take those medications, some people couldn't get out of bed. Some people couldn't go out into the community. So those medications would definitely be covered because it allows them to be able to function in society with you or me or anyone. What else? Glasses. Glasses would count because without those glasses, if you had a severe visual impairment, or I know without my contacts, I couldn't even tell you who was sitting next to me probably, those would definitely count. So that would fall under a visual impairment, even though you can see with your glasses or contacts or anything like that. So.
Now, on the topic of disabilities, there's 2 ways to look at it. The old-fashioned way, what we would call it, would be the medical model. The medical model views disability as a problem. It's a problem. It's no good. Now, the more progressive current model is the social model of looking at a disability. And the social model views it as a natural form of diversity. So you can see there's 2 very extreme ways of perceiving disability. The medical model sees a person with a disability as broken or sick, and they require curing or healing because, of course, they see this as a problem, a bad thing, so we need to fix this. But the social model says that the disability is actually caused by the way society is organized rather than by a person's impairment or difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about society on the next slide, how that society and their attitudes is actually the biggest barrier for people with disabilities. The medical model goal toward disability is that it needs to be fixed. And the social model goal is the disability doesn't need to be fixed, but the societal barriers that restrict life choices for people with disabilities, those need to be removed. The medical model says that to solve the problem, medical intervention it should be used if needed, and that health professionals are responsible for providing this prevention. And the social model says, well, promoting change in the attitudes and perceptions of people in society towards disabilities, that's actually going to be the most effective approach.
And I think if you've been around or been an adult in the last probably 30 or 40 years, you probably can tell a difference in the acceptance of people with disabilities moving toward that social model. In the past, I've done case management, and I've had older clients who they grew up being shoved in a room or put in a hospital or something like that. They were a problem, and they were looked at as, we'll just medicate them and put them in a room and not have to deal with them. Whereas now, obviously, we know that that would be a huge uproar in society. So we are making changes and we are progressing, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The society is not yet to the point, I don't believe, where they look at people with disabilities and think, oh, let's figure out a way to help them get included. It's still a fight, and it's still an effort on agencies like ours to advocate for equal inclusion. But there has been a shift over the years.
Sure. Yeah, and under the social model, like Lindsay said, the old medical model, they just wanted to put them away into an institution, just out of sight, out of mind. But now people realize, people with disabilities are just like everyone else. They just do things differently, but they have things to contribute to society. They want to work. They want to go to school. They want to have a family.
Yeah. And for example, I have a friend that I used to work with, and she has a daughter. I'm 38, almost 38, and she has a daughter who's the same age, and her daughter was born with Down syndrome. And so the doctor actually came into the room when her daughter was born 38 years ago and told her it was time to sign her over to an institution. And the mom obviously was not for that, even though the doctors were insistent on it. And now that lady has had a job in the community. She's working on learning independent living skills. She hopes to have her own place one day. So there was a lot of potential there that 38 years ago no one even realized. So that's just kind of a little example that something as simple as Down syndrome could have gotten someone put in an institution years ago, and now we're so inclusive and it's mainstream, and we're seeing kids with Down syndrome in advertisements. I think the Gerber baby right now has Down syndrome. So it's so accepted, and it doesn't come easily, and it doesn't, it's not something that's just given. It's something we have to fight for, but it's definitely worth the fight.
Sure. So, like I mentioned earlier, societal barriers really are the biggest barriers for people with disabilities, and those are the society's attitudes and perceptions. One example would be an inaccessible environment, buildings, transport, information, communication. There are still a lot of buildings out there, public buildings, that aren't accessible to people with disabilities. I worked in Hazard for 9 months, and I learned that in Harlan County there's two courthouses, an old courthouse and a new courthouse, and the courthouse that you would have to go to renew and get a new accessible placard for your car was actually on the second story of the old courthouse that didn't have an elevator or ramps. So that kind of didn't really make sense. So to get your placard.
And I don't know if it was with you or with our Murray office, one of the places would have town hall meetings or city hall meetings, and those were also on the second floor and not accessible to people with disabilities. So, how are you able as a community to make decisions and participate in that if you can't even get into the room or get into the building? So obviously that prevents inclusion.
Right. And there are still some segregated services where they don't make accommodations for people with different disabilities, so they're not able to either access them or they're not able to fully engage in them. A lack of useful education. One really sad thing about the education part is that oftentimes people with disabilities going through school, there's not much expected of them. They don't have, they don't place, what is it?
Value?
No, they don't expect as much from their students with disabilities, right? And they're not, a lot of students don't get the accommodations that they need in school to even receive the education the way they could. Poverty, a significant number of people with disabilities are in poverty. One big reason for that is, employment discrimination. Employers, they just don't understand, that people with disabilities do have qualifications, job qualifications. They do have things to offer. And then attitudes. prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, devaluing, like Lindsay mentioned earlier, we have come a long way, especially since the signing of the ADA. But the attitude still is the biggest barrier. And then, of course, the belief in the medical model towards disabilities.
Mm-hmm. And Pam, we see your question. It's actually a really good question. I guess, which obviously we're no experts, so we can just kind of offer what we would, I guess, our advice, but take it with a grain of salt. You know, I guess the big thing is understanding why these people are uncomfortable with her. You know, is it just a matter of differences? And yeah, I mean, a lot of times that's the problem with like supported employment or employment in general for people with disabilities. A lot of times, you know, people with disabilities aren't going to just come into a job and get it on day one. None of us can. A lot of times there's a bigger learning curve. So, you know, I would be interested to know why they're uncomfortable. Sometimes it's just people are kind of standoffish and kind of cold to people with disabilities, not because they're rude, they just don't know, or they don't want to insult someone by asking a question that they would think is dumb or disrespectful or something like that. So, you know, it might be something that you just need to have an open conversation, whether formally or informally, and just see maybe how you can help her feel more comfortable, how you can help your coworkers feel more comfortable. Because, you know, it is something different, and it's not, when we bring people into our workplace or our communities with disabilities and we're not used to that, you know, it's a learning process for all of us, and it can be uncomfortable for all of us, but I think it opens a conversation.
And Pam, I think that maybe some things that you'll learn from this etiquette, because there's we will talk about different types of disabilities and how to interact with someone with different disability. So something that you might take away later in this webinar, you might be able to take and use with your staff.
So we operate not just our center, but everyone in the disability world under person first language. This can be a little odd, I guess, at first until you get the hang of it. It's not something that comes normally or easily. Naturally. Right. We have people, even in our agency, that have been in this field for a long time, and they still struggle with using person-first language. Basically, what it is putting the person before the disability, and it describes what the person has, not what the person is. So you're putting the value on the person, and then you're adding the disability just as a description. So it could be, you know, the man in the wheelchair, and I think there are some examples on the following slide. But you want to make sure that you're really talking about the person and not qualifying that person only because they have a disability.
Now, I myself have lived with a lifelong physical disability. It's very obvious when I walk. And I've only been in this field for about 4 years. So my mom joked when she found out that I was going to be working with people with disabilities. She said, "That's kind of funny. You've never spent much time around people with disabilities, so you're a person with a disability who's going to have to learn how to interact with people with disabilities." So with this person-first language, it was a big learning thing for me too. And I think sometimes I revert back to some of the old language. It is a learning process. And like what Lindsay said in the very beginning of this, we're not the politically correct police. We don't expect you to have all these memorized by the end of the webinar or even overnight. But it really is just a process, and by being aware of this and like making an effort to use it from day to day, or, you know, on the occasion that you have the opportunity, it really does change the way you think or perceive someone with a disability. So why should we use it, person-first language and preferred terms? So number one, to avoid defining a person by their disability, because a disability is something that someone has. It's not who they are. my physical disability doesn't define me. I am so much more than just my disability. Using this language, it really does shape attitudes and perceptions, maybe not right away, but over time, the more people see the person first before the disability, it really will change attitudes and the way you see them. It avoids supporting old stereotypes. And then it's, just to model appropriate language. Some of the old language towards people with disabilities is kind of
very disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll kind of talk about that some on the next page. All right, so here are some examples of maybe some common phrases that people use, especially in that left-hand column. Now, like I said, we all make mistakes. Number 10, handicap parking. I am horrible at using accessible parking, and this is my field. So it has taken me a long time to get a lot of this out of my vocabulary. I've been in this field for 9 years, and it still slips out sometimes. But, I think the big thing, and it's with any culture, but especially with disabilities, you're going to have jerks out there that are going to be offended no matter what you say.
Right.
But I feel like from the people that we have worked with over the years with disabilities, if you're willing to be open and learn and try make an effort, that is going to go a long way. And we'll kind of, as we go over the different disabilities, we love sharing stories about things Melanie and I have done that are they could be super offensive and we didn't even know. Melanie said a service dog once. So,
yeah.
So we'll get to that. But, it is and no one is perfect at this. Like I said, it is a total learning experience. But as you can see on here, words like handicap, crippled, disabled, you want to turn that around. Put your person first, a person with a disability. Normal, healthy, able-bodied. I'm a parent of a child with disabilities, and I hate the word normal. Only because, they're kids, and especially mine's a teenager, none of them are normal. So it doesn't matter if she has some extra medical concerns or things like that. To be told that she's not a, quote, normal child is very offensive, because who is normal in this society, if we're honest?
Right. Wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. The preferred term is a wheelchair user or uses a wheelchair. And just that term wheelchair bound, that really shows the way society views wheelchairs. They view the person as being stuck in them and bound to them, when actually a wheelchair is what gives that person the freedom to access their community, to live their lives, to get out and about in society. So the wheelchair is not something that's binding them. It's actually giving them freedom. Mm-hmm. A victim of or suffers from multiple sclerosis, it's a person who has multiple sclerosis. We also point out that whenever someone is thought of as a victim or suffering, we think of that person that they have multiple sclerosis or any disability, and that from day to day, they're just suffering from it. They're not living. It's just really weighing on them. And in many cases, people who have disabilities, we don't feel like I don't feel like I'm suffering from my disability. I get out. I live life. I don't feel like a victim of it.
Mm-hmm. Number 5 is a big one. I don't even like saying the word retarded. It's very old-fashioned. At one time, even 9 years ago when I got into this field, that was an official diagnosis of mental retardation. And over time, that has become very outdated. It was way outdated even before I got into this field. I don't know why. It's only been in recent years that there's been a push to eliminate that word. And a lot of it comes from, kids. I've been in schools, and I remember being in school, and we would call each other that name, not having a clue what it meant. But it is very offensive because it is, talking about someone who is delayed, either intellectually or developmentally. Talking about slow people or special people. There are a lot of parents, and I'm one. I know, we talk about special needs kids with special needs. Some people are very offended by that whole special needs thing, only because those kids don't have needs that other kids in the same situation wouldn't need. Nothing really makes them special necessarily. But again, it's one of those, it's going to depend on who you're talking to, if it's an offensive word or not. Just don't use the R word. That's our big thing. So epileptic or epileptic fits, you know, use a person with epilepsy or a person with a seizure disorder. The next one, 7, mentally ill, crazy, psycho nuts. And those, I think, have just really gotten into our vocabulary as a society that we just throw it around. And I'll be honest, this is probably one that I am not the best at.
Oh, especially with the word crazy.
Yeah.
That's a hard one to not use.
Yeah, it is. So that would be a person with a mental disorder, a person with a mental illness, something like that. So again, you're putting the focus on the person and then adding a mental illness or whatever as only one small segment of that person, because all of these are just, you don't define a person by their disability, no matter how big or how small. That's only one small portion of what the person is as a whole. So we want to really change the wording. The blind people, blind as a bat. I think our boss has said, or not our boss, someone has said, that little blind girl. Mm-hmm. So again, a person with a visual impairment or person that's blind, it's not something that, you know, again, it's one of those generational things. It's not something that we say necessarily to be offensive. It's just, it's what we've grown up saying. Deaf, mute, deaf and dumb. We would prefer that to be replaced with a person who is hard of hearing, person who is deaf, deaf people, person with a hearing impairment. There's some different ways to do that.
Now, the deaf community is actually pretty unique in that, I won't speak for every single one of them, but in general, they don't see themselves as having a disability. So we actually don't do a lot of work with people who are deaf. They don't really identify as having a disability. It's a pretty unique thing about that culture. Mm-hmm. And then again, like Lindsay said, handicap accessible, handicap parking, handicap hang tag. That was a hard one too for me to, like, I still can't get my husband to not use handicap. I just stopped trying. I'm like, okay, I know he means well, but the term that we prefer to use is accessible parking or an accessible hang tag. Again, handicap is just kind of an old-fashioned term.
And I guess here we should point out, I mean, there's always exceptions to the rule. People with autism, mm-hmm. they actually prefer to be called, and again, right. This is a generalization. This is not, don't take this to court or anything, but most people with autism or on the autism spectrum want to be called autistic. Right?
Right, autistic people.
Autistic people. It's not, it's not, you don't have to do person first for them. So right. A lot of times it's just going to be kind of like with different cultures. You're just going to have to learn kind of what the acceptable wording is. And again, it's all a learning process. So this is not something that you're going to leave today and be 100% set on handling interactions with people with disabilities.
Right. So, meeting a person with a disability. Number one, a handshake. It is okay to put your hand out when you're going to meet someone with a disability, no matter what type of disability it is. That person has met with people before, so if they can shake their hand, they will shake their hand. We do work with a young man who he's not able to form his hand like in a handshake, but he will give you a fist bump. So if you do put your hand out towards them, and generally they'll make a motion too as well. A person will. That also goes for someone who is blind. If you meet someone who is, and I didn't know this until I started working in this field, that most blind people will either go ahead to make that gesture, and if they don't, it is okay to tell them, like, oh, I'm extending my hand, can I shake your hand? Speak directly to the person with a disability, no matter what kind of disability it is. Oftentimes people with disabilities might have someone with them, And if you don't have experience interacting with someone with a disability, you have a tendency to speak to the person that's with the person with the disability, or ask them questions. So yeah, you just want to speak directly to them.
And my favorite one is don't ask. You know, it seems pretty given, but a lot of people, I don't get offended with it for my daughter. I don't think you do either, because it is a learning thing, especially with kids. They want to know, you know, why does my daughter do things differently? But some people, I would say judge that on the specific experience and how well you know someone. There are people out there that are like, look, I don't ask you for your medical records or your medical history, so you don't have a right to ask me why I walk the way I do, or why I do things I do, or you know, why I have a scar here. So that would be, I would give the general advice not to ask, but there are people out there who use that as a learning experience. I feel like Melanie and I are one of those, and we know a lot of people like that are willing to just educate. Treat adults like adults. That's especially big with intellectual disabilities, only because sometimes they do appear very childlike in their mannerisms or things that they say, but they are still adults. So you know, have the respect with them. Don't use baby talk. Don't talk down to them. Just treat them like a typical adult, right?
Be patient and give your undivided attention, especially with someone with a cognitive or intellectual disability. Yeah, be patient when you're talking to them or listening to them, and give them your undivided attention. Make an effort to show that you're interested in what they're saying. We'll actually touch more on this in one of the other slides. Don't yell at the person. And when I say that, it's because society has a tendency to speak louder with lots of different disabilities, not just someone who has a hearing impairment. If there's someone who's blind, they think that they need to speak louder. I've probably been guilty of that at one point. I don't know why we feel like we need to talk louder to get our point across.
A lot of times it's not even something that we mean to do,
right?
But just be aware of it. And yes, Denise, you're exactly right. Eye contact, we kind of put that in with speaking directly to them and, you know, giving your undivided attention. Eye contact is definitely something that we would suggest. But Elizabeth, you do have a great point. People with autism do have trouble in social situations, especially with making eye contact. But what I've done in the past, especially until I get to know someone, is I will make eye contact, but if I see that they're not making eye contact with me, then I'll kind of shift my eyes. It's kind of one of those things that it's going to vary from person to person, and honestly all of this information is, because we can give you a blanket training, but there's always going to be exceptions to the rules. So don't pretend to understand what a person is saying if you don't. We'll talk about like some speech delays and things like that. You might be agreeing to something that you don't know you're agreeing to, or kind of setting yourself up for an awkward situation. So also using common expressions like "see you soon." Melanie, you want to share your?
Oh, when I first started working in this field, I worked in an office with a woman who is blind. She's completely blind, and one of our other coworkers was afraid to say things like "I'll see you tomorrow" or "see you soon." He just thought that was very offensive because she couldn't see, and that's something that I had never even thought of. But you know, we kind of, you know, she made him realize, and we all made him realize that is fine. She even would talk about movies that she has seen, or it's okay if you're working or interacting with someone and you think of a movie. Oh, have you seen that? Just because they can't see does not mean that they don't experience the movie. They can listen to it and still get an experience. So in general, they don't. It's okay to see things, to use phrases with the word "see" in it with someone who is blind. And relax and don't be afraid. Like we've said, you know, this is just kind of a general presentation to start you on your way to feeling more comfortable interacting with people with disabilities if you aren't already, and just to try to make those interactions as successful and effective and comfortable as they possibly can be. So just, just try to relax. Don't be afraid to interact with people with disabilities. We still make our mistakes, and we're in this field. So
we'll share a lot of stories with you. So. All right, so we're going to go over some different disabilities that you may come in contact with just in working with the general public. These could be things that you know. These just might be things that you never thought of. Sometimes I feel like we don't always know how to handle a situation or whatever until we do kind of come off as cold or uncaring or rude. And so we just want to give you guys this information. And again, it could be stuff that you already know, but here we go. So, so interacting with a person who uses a wheelchair, look at that wheelchair as an extension of the body. That's, like Melanie was saying, that's what gets them around. That's what helps them be independent and mobile. So treat that body as personal, that wheelchair as personal space. I know I've had experiences with my daughter. We might be in line like at a theme park or something, and someone wants to lean up on the back of her chair because they're just tired of standing. I've seen people like put their backpacks or purses on the back of somebody's wheelchair.
I've been to a busy, crowded conference before where someone didn't know the person that was next to them in the wheelchair, and they rested their foot up on the wheel of their wheelchair.
Oh, wow.
Right. Highly inappropriate.
Right. And don't move the chair without permission. I wouldn't come up to you and put my arms or my hands on your arms and move you out of my way. You would think that's pretty rude. And so when someone is in a wheelchair and they're dependent on that device, again, that's going to be the same thing. You wouldn't just come up and just start moving them. Communicate eye to eye. Clear a path. If you're with someone that you know is going to have mobility issues or that is in a wheelchair, make sure that you pay attention to chairs being pushed up to the tables or, things that are going to be, if say you're walking with a friend to lunch and, pay attention to curb cuts if they're able to get up on the curbs or get off. If you're going to a restaurant that is accessible, keep those things in mind. And that kind of goes along with know the geography. If someone asks you, where's the front door to this library, and you send them to one on the side that's not accessible, then you're not being much help. So make sure that you kind of know, if you're sending them to this direction or that direction, make sure that it's not a gravel lot or holes all in the, lawn or something like that.
And don't give directions unless you specifically know. I want to get back to the number 2 really quick, communicate eye to eye. If it seems like you're going to be part of a lengthy conversation with someone who uses a wheelchair, try to get down to their level, whether you just crouch down for a few minutes or if you're near a chair where you can sit down. Because after a lengthy conversation, the person in the wheelchair has to look up at you, and that actually can become uncomfortable or painful in the neck. So,
and there's something to be said too for standing over someone in any conversation. It's a very kind of dominant kind of body language or whatever. So that's a big deal to get down on an eye-to-eye level.
So meeting a person with a disability that affects their speech. This is really a tough one for all of us, even us in this field. The best you can do is really pay attention, be patient, and wait. And it can be tough to understand what they're saying, but that's where you really need to pay attention and focus because you actually might be able to understand the more you pay attention. Be patient, especially if it's taken them a while to speak. Ask the person to repeat what is said. If you don't understand what they're saying, it is okay. That the person who has a disability that affects their speech, they realize that, and they know that they're hard to understand. So don't be afraid to ask them to repeat it. That's not it's not annoying to them. It actually shows that you really want to know what they're saying. You're making an effort to understand.
And it's safe for you because, like you said before, you could be agreeing to something that you don't even know you're agreeing to, or giving advice that you don't know you're giving. So that just kind of protects you as well.
Right. I actually was with I met with a young man at a library who had a speech impairment, and he had a caregiver working with him. And I was really trying to understand what he was saying, and at one point she looked at me and she said, "Oh, I never can understand him. I just always smile and nod my head." And I thought, that's the worst thing that you could do. And that's very evident and obvious to a lot of people. They realize that you're not really paying much attention. And sometimes if they do have someone with them and you're really trying to understand what they're saying and you've asked them to repeat it and you just can't get it, there are times that I have looked to the person that's with them to kind of help me out, because they're with the person more often, so they pick up on words or sounds, and they know what that means. But it's really just making an effort first to try to understand. Be prepared for a person to use assistive technology. So I worked with a young man who he did not speak, but he had a board that he used, and he could look at the letters on the keyboard and it would type out what he is saying. So, and while he's doing that, let him, is there a question?
Oh, go ahead. I was just reading. You go ahead.
Okay. And resist finishing sentences. This is a really hard one, especially for me in general. I've had to work on, my patience, so it's hard for me to not want to finish people's sentences, but you really should resist that. With someone who is speaking slowly or trying to get it out, even with a person who uses assistive technology, like the young man I told you, he would type with his eyes, and once I got to a point where I knew what he was going to type, it was so hard to not just go ahead and say it or answer his question. But yeah, just be patient and don't finish their sentences.
Yeah, and that's actually a good comment as well. Like, that's a great point, because a lot of times a caregiver might be overbearing or interferes with the conversation, and so that might lead to some uncomfortable situations. I think the problem with that is we're really, like my generation and my daughter's generation, we're more, I guess, liberal to some degree and accepting of people with disabilities compared to, say, my mom or older caregivers. So, as we're changing our model from the medical model to the social model, you're going to experience some things like that where you've got overbearing protective parents or caregivers because they're just used to spending their life with people not really valuing their child or who they're caring for. So a lot of times that's not really something that they're trying to do to be rude. It's just that's what they're used to. But honestly, as a parent with a child with disabilities, I have the utmost respect for someone who will take the time to get to know her and have a conversation with her instead of expecting us to just talk around her.
Engaging a person who is blind. I especially have made many mistakes in this regard. Luckily, the woman that I worked with, she has a great sense of humor and she's very easy to get along with because I had never spent any time around someone who was blind. So the greetings, it kind of goes back, we mentioned if you're meeting someone for the first time who is blind, you would greet them just like someone who wasn't blind. And again, it's okay to, they'll oftentimes put their hand out to shake your hand, you'll shake it, and if they don't, like I said earlier, it is okay to extend your hand and let them know. Departing, I had the hardest time with this. If you're in a conversation with a person who is blind, don't just walk away without letting them know. That was one of the hardest things because I shared an office with this woman, and we'd be in a conversation. I'd get up to go to the bathroom or get up to go to coffee room or get up to do whatever, and as I'm walking away down the hall, I hear that she's still speaking, and I'm like, oh crap, that's right, I keep forgetting to let her know that I'm about to leave the room. So, yeah, just, I've gotten better at it, and I'm pretty good at it now, but that does take time. Guiding someone who is blind. Don't just assume that if someone doesn't have a service dog or they're cane, don't assume that they want to be guided. They will tell you if they need to be guided, and they'll generally grab the back of your elbow. Now me, with my physical disability and the way I walk, I'm not a very good guide. I have guided her, but I bounce all over the place, and yeah, so I'm probably not the best guide. But yeah, just leave it up to them whether or not they need a guide. They will ask you. If you are guiding someone, be aware of the landscape. So if you're walking on concrete and you're about to go into grass or gravel, let them know ahead of time so they can kind of prepare for that. If you're going to step up on a step or a curb, be aware of that too and share that with them. Let them know. Details matter. I learned with her, like just during everyday conversation, that I would use more descriptive words and describe a situation more so that she could get the experience of what I was talking about more. And I didn't just know to do that. I noticed that through conversations, she would ask lots of questions about details, and that's when I learned, oh, okay, yeah, I'm trying to give her the best experience that she can have. Guide dogs and canes. Not every person who's blind uses a guide dog or a service dog, and then not all of them use canes. Some of them use both. And this is one that I didn't know. Not everyone who's blind reads Braille. I just assumed that, you know, that was like, okay, you are blind and you're going to go and get taught how to read Braille. So that's, you can't make that assumption because they don't all know it.
All right, so the next one is a little tricky only because it's not necessarily, well, it's probably almost never something that you're going to be able to see just from looking at someone. Someone with a cognitive impairment, this could be something such as a learning disorder, delays with intellectual disabilities, things like that, a brain injury or brain function. So the important thing for them, and this is going to be something probably that maybe you're talking to them and you realize maybe something is off here. So this might be something that you're going to have to change the way that you approach them as the interaction goes on. Keep your communication concrete. Don't use abstract views or abstract examples of things. Make sure that you're being very precise and clear with what you're saying to them. Stay on point. I know a lot of us have a tendency to ramble sometimes. And so a lot of times you're going to lose their focus. So stay on point and get the important stuff that you need to get out. Allow the person time. I'm really guilty with this one. A lot of times when you talk to someone with a disability that is an intellectual-based disability, they need time to process what you've said and formulate what they want to say back to you. So a lot of times it's easy to just say, okay, well, obviously you didn't care what I just said, but they're soaking it in and they are coming up with what they need their response to be. So give them time for that. Again, it's going to be easier the more you get to know someone. Focus on the person. If you are distracted or seem to not care, or you're on your phone or your computer or just not giving your undivided attention, even if they do have a cognitive impairment, they're going to notice that. So just make sure that your focus is on them and you're trying to put all your effort into communicating with them. You may have to repeat some things to them so that it sinks in. They might ask questions that you've already answered. So there may be a lot of repetition, and the biggest thing is just patience. It's going to maybe be uncomfortable, and it's going to seem like, man, it is so hard to have a simple conversation with this person, but I think if you follow these guidelines, I think that will be a nice little,
it'll make it easier. And communicating with someone who is deaf or uses an assisted hearing device. So let that person take the lead, whether or not they're going to use American Sign Language, English Sign Language, writing notes, lip reading. Not every person who is deaf uses sign language or knows how to use it. But if they're going to communicate with you, they'll take the lead on that. They know how they're going to be able to communicate and get across what they're saying. Talk directly to the person just like you would anyone else that you're having a conversation with. Especially pay attention if you know that the person can read your lips. You'll want to make sure that you face him or her directly. And it may help to simplify sentences and use more facial expressions and body language. That might seem kind of weird to do at first. I'm pretty animated anyway, so I think that if anyone interacting with me, they'll kind of, with my body language and my facial expressions, they'll help me go or know what's going on. I don't know if any one of you has ever watched a sign language interpreter, a really good one. They fascinate me because their body language and their expressions, I mean, they're really getting across.
The best thing we love to watch are the sign language interpreters at concerts, and you can look that up on YouTube. It's so amazing to watch. They really put the emotion of the lyrics and the beat and things like that in there so that someone with a hearing impairment can still get all aspects of that concert and that music, and it is absolutely amazing.
BSL. You know what? I don't know what BSL is.
Are you maybe meaning ASL and ESL maybe? Those are two different forms of communication. A lot of similarities. Oh, British Sign Language. You know, I'm not really sure.
I think that there probably is differences because we have like terms and slang words that we use. Yeah, our dialect's a little bit different even though it's English. So
right.
And gain the person's attention prior to speaking. So if they're not facing you and you want to start talking with them, it's okay to, you know, tap their shoulder or maybe touch their elbow, you know, to let that is an appropriate way of getting their attention.
And I think an important disclaimer here probably, we're not, obviously we said not everyone can read lips or use ASL or whatever. If communicating with someone who is deaf or has a hearing impairment, I would assume that they can read lips. So if you're not talking to them, if you go to your coworker and you're having a conversation like, oh my gosh, you won't believe what this guy's asking me, they're going to know more than likely what you're saying and what you're talking about without hearing you, no matter how much that you're whispering or whatever. So I would probably throw that disclaimer in there. I mean, at the same time, don't assume everyone can read lips, but I would err on the side of caution with that and just be careful if you're having a conversation about someone who has a hearing impairment.
And if you're speaking with someone who has an interpreter with them, speak to that person. And then if they're signing back, look at them because they're talking to you as they're signing. So as they're signing, look at them, and then, you know, you can look at the interpreter for the interpretation.
And that's really difficult and awkward in the beginning, and that's also the same if you've got an interpreter for a different language as well, because your conversation is directly with that person. So you're just getting the benefit of an interpreter. So definitely make sure that you're holding the conversation and the eye contact with that person regardless of the language barrier. All right, so a person with a mental disorder or mental illness. You know, this one is a touchy subject and it's tricky because of the news. We hear so much about people doing outrageous, terroristic things in the news, and it's often blamed on a history of mental illness. But there are so many people out there with some sort of mental health diagnosis that are not violent or easily stressed. I know I have a family member who is on Prozac, and when she started, it was very much looked at in a negative way. I remember hearing comments like, oh, well, you know, there was that one guy who went in and shot up his whole workplace because he was on Prozac. Well, that's one guy, and we don't know what's going on. So when we hear mental illness and mental disorders, and you know, we really kind of get a little scary because we assume the worst, but there are tons of people who are living and working in their communities and managing their mental illness or mental health with or without medication. Not everyone is going to need medication. They can lead independent lives. They can hold jobs. So be comfortable in behaving in the same manner you would with anyone else. Don't expect that they're, just because maybe they have a mental illness that you know about, that they're an unsafe person to be around, or they're a threat to your safety, or a threat to your library location, or anything like that. And again, this is probably going to be something like cognitive disabilities that you're not going to necessarily know. You might assume, which that can always get us in trouble, but it might. You interact with tons of people every day, I guarantee you, that have a mental health diagnosis that you either would never have a clue or not even suspect anything was different. Right.
Okay. Invisible disabilities. There are a lot of disabilities that you can't just see firsthand. They may not be visible on the outside of a person. They may affect a person's bones, muscles, nerves, cells, or their cognition. Some examples include a brain injury, epilepsy, hearing loss, multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue syndrome. These are all disabilities that you would never know unless a person shared them with you. People without disabilities often assume that people with invisible forms of disability can work just as hard, walk just as far, or sit as long as people without disabilities, simply because people with invisible disabilities do not look disabled.
Right.
So if someone shares with you a struggle that they're having related to a disability that you didn't know that they have, don't just assume. Now, we're not saying that some people don't take advantage of their disability or that some people don't exaggerate their disability. But if you're interacting or working with someone who they're struggling to walk or stand for a long period of time, or struggling to sit for a long period of time, don't just assume that, oh, they're being a baby, or maybe they're being lazy. Even if they haven't told you that they do have an invisibility that you can't see, don't just make the assumption that they're being lazy.
Yeah, and I think this is probably on the next slide or the next couple of slides, but I think it's easy to assume a lot of times that people with disabilities, because they're able to function one day and not able to function maybe a following day, I think sometimes it's easy for us to just assume that they're making it up based on what they do or don't want to do in the workplace or in the community. But, you know, a lot of these, you know, I know people with epilepsy, some days are worse than others, and so don't assume that just because someone is functioning perfectly fine today, that if they come in and have some kind of ailment due to an invisible disability, that they're faking it.
Right. Stephanie, she has had depression and anxiety all her life, and she's encountered people who believe that because it can't be seen, it's something that she made up or tried to draw attention. I've experienced depression throughout my life, and it can be debilitating from day to day. I've gotten to a point where I know how to manage it and cope with it and live with it without other people knowing. But no, it can be very debilitating.
Absolutely.
And if you don't go through that, you know, people don't understand.
Right.
People do not always choose to identify themselves as a person with a disability if they have one that's invisible, simply because the stigma attached to a disability and, you know, discrimination that could result if society knew that they had one. So there are lots of reasons why people would choose to not share that. But if they do share with you that you have one, don't refuse to believe it or doubt what they're saying just because you can't see it. If you are aware that a person has a form of an invisible disability, the best thing is to simply speak with them and ask them what they're able to do and what they cannot do. And if you see that someone's struggling with something, you could simply ask, how can I help you with this, or how can we make it easier for you to do? If they say they are unable to do something, do not attempt to somehow coax or convince them to try anyway.
Because a lot of times it's not a choice.
Right.
So arguing or being like, oh, come on, that's not necessarily going to make them just suddenly be able to do the task at hand. And if you're unaware that a person has an invisible disability, but you see them struggling, ask how you can help them, or ask how a task or activity can be made easier. This would fall into like an accommodation. And a lot of times, we think of accommodations as something that are very major and expensive. And a lot of times it's just a matter of, changing something up of how something's done, whether with a coworker or, a patron that comes into your library. Don't assume that because someone might need some extra help or might need an accommodation that it's going to be too expensive and too hard and too demanding, and you just don't want to deal with it. Because a lot of times it's just something very simple. It's just a matter of, and a lot of times people with invisible disabilities are going to know that they've struggled with something throughout their schooling or adulthood, so they're going to know what kind of help or what kind of assistance that they might need to help them be more efficient.
Cynthia asked, would a person with severe allergies that require them to have an EpiPen, would then be considered to have a disability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For sure. That would fall under using your medication or accommodations, for sure. Traumatic brain injury and PTSD, we're seeing a lot of people coming into our center with those concerns, and it's one of those things that falls right into this. It's not something that can be seen with the eyes necessarily, but it does highly affect their lives with brain injuries or PTSD. So yes, definitely you want to be sensitive about that.
Okay, so the last slide on invisible disabilities. Signs of a possible invisible disability. If someone has trouble following a conversation, they may not respond when you call or wave. They may make a request that seems strange to you, or may say or do something that seems inappropriate. So a lot of people that we've worked with traumatic brain injuries, that, especially with that, the inappropriate part. So don't make assumptions about the person. If they haven't shared that they have a disability, but you see some of these signs, just try to be aware and keep that in mind and realize that there might be a disability there that they haven't disclosed, and be open-minded.
So this one is my biggest pet peeve, accessible parking. If you do not have a tag that allows you to park in a spot, please do not park there. It's not just the nice thing to do, it's the law. And I drop my daughter off every morning at school, and people use those accessible spots as a drop-off just to let their kids get out. So that's a very big irritant of us, and it's a big source of advocacy that we're doing. We've actually created some flyers that we can put on cars to remind them that even just parking in that spot for 60 seconds is a minute too long. And if you're driving someone's car who has an accessible tag, if that tag is not yours, then please don't use it. That's all I can really say. Oh, and going back to, let me just go back before I get ahead of myself. One thing, too, I want to point out here is this also falls in line with invisible disabilities. Just because someone gets out of their car, and I've really had to learn this, just because someone gets out of their car and does not look like they have a disability, don't assume that they're taking advantage of it. I have my daughter, she can walk, but for long distances, she gets very fatigued, especially when it's hot or really cold outside. And so there was a time we went to Walmart not long ago, and I hung my tag up, and we went in. It was going to be a short trip, so she was walking, And when I came out, I had a lady waiting by my car who was so aggressive and so rude because we had used that spot. And she was accusing us of not deserving that, of using a tag that wasn't ours. And, you know, first of all, some lady who's yelling at me, I'm not going to take the time to educate her on my daughter's health conditions. I don't really think that she deserves that explanation. So just don't assume that because someone looks like they don't need it, that they don't. You've got people with MS, arthritis. You know, I've heard people get parking tags for migraines because when it hits, they have got to get out. People with autism, if they're in a store and they get overstimulated, it's much easier to get them to an accessible spot with a tag than for them to risk running through the parking lot. So they don't just give out accessible tags just to whoever asks. There's always a reason and there's always a doctor's statement, so don't assume that someone doesn't need it. And this next one was a big learning experience for me because I didn't know the difference. So those stripes there, it's not to take up an extra spot, and it's not like a bonus accessible parking spot. Striped lines and aisles next to accessible spots are for loading and unloading. We've seen a lot of times that people think, well, I have a tag and there's no accessible spots available, so I'm just going to park in here. But as you can see from the picture on the right, people need that space to load and unload. There's a reason that it's there. And honestly, before we did this training and I was in this field, actually, even when I was in this field, I didn't know what those were for. So our coworker in the Murray office, I know she goes to Walmart a lot for the office, and she's in an accessible van. And there's one man all the time who is a veteran, and he has an accessible tag, and he parks in the striped area. And she's had to wait for as long as 45 minutes for him to come out to be able to load into her own vehicle. So just keep that in mind. It's not bonus parking.
Okay, service animals. So I'm paying attention to the time. So we have a few slides on the service animals. So we're gonna go through here kind of quickly. So a service animal is a trained dog or miniature horse that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability. Treat a service animal as an extension of the body. I did not know this. This was a big learning thing for me. I had never been around service dogs. I didn't know that you couldn't pet them. They're actually, when they're working, that's their job, and petting them can interfere with the service that they provide to their owners. So treat them as the extension of the owner's body. Just pretend that they are not there. And if you do know that service dog's name, don't call out to it or talk to it.
And some people who have a service dog will tell you a fake name or a different name so that when you do call it out, their dog won't respond.
Right, yeah. A person is allowed to have one service animal at a time. Now, people get service animals and emotional support animals confused or mixed. So an emotional support animal is an animal, typically a dog or a cat, that provides a therapeutic benefit to its owner through companionship. The Air Carrier Access Act and Fair Housing Act, they both recognize ESA, but the ADA does not, so businesses are not required to allow emotional support animals in the business. Under the ADA, state and local governments, businesses, and nonprofit organizations that serve the public generally must allow service animals, to accompany people with disabilities. However, they must be harnessed, leashed, or tethered unless the devices would interfere with the service that they're performing.
And also, I know a lot of times we get questions, because Melanie and I are both trained on the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, so a lot of times places will call us for clarification. A lot of times we get calls mostly for someone who maybe has put their dog in the shopping cart at the grocery store. Ideally, service animals should have all feet on the floor unless their job requires them to be closer to the body or in the lab. So our Louisville office, I remember, had a call that someone came in with a service dog and asked for a high chair for their dog. And so obviously the restaurant called and wanted to know if that was the law, and that is not. So people do take advantage of this, obviously, and a lot of times they think that they are covered and you don't have a right to ask any questions about their animal, but you actually do have the right. Under the ADA, you guys are, or anyone, is allowed to ask what specific service, why are they required because of the disability. And all service dogs are trained to complete specific tasks. If not, they would fall under to the ESA, Emotional Support Animal. So there should be specific tasks that that person should be able to tell you that the animal can do, whether it's retrieving medication, monitoring for seizure activity, things like that. You are, as a public employee, allowed to ask these two questions, and still not be discriminating against under the ADA.
Right. Allergies and fear of dogs are not valid reasons for denying access or refusing service to people using service animals. So if someone brings a service animal into the library and another library patron, complains and says she's either afraid of them or she has allergies, that's not a reason to ask the person or the dog to leave. You can assign them, if possible, to different locations or rooms, but no, you cannot ask them to leave.
And we've heard occurrences where maybe there is a dog that is well-behaved in a restaurant, and someone has refused and talked to the manager, refused to eat there because they don't like dogs, and they don't want dogs around their food or them, but that, you can't do that. So,
right. And there are instances where a service animal, a legitimate service animal, can be removed. So if that animal is out of control and the handler does not take effective action to control it, you can ask them to leave, or if the animal is not housebroken. Also, if that animal is not, they haven't taken care of it, they haven't bathed it, it smells really bad,
there's fleas or
right,
things like that.
Exactly. That is an appropriate time to ask the owner or an animal to leave. However, if they are asked to leave, then the staff must offer the person with a disability the opportunity to obtain the goods or services without the animals present. So if someone comes in to check out a book or something else, if they have to leave because of problems with the animal, you still have to make that service available to them. So you'll have to come up with a way that they can still check out that book and get that book
right
to them.
Barbara, you've got an excellent question because we get that actually a lot. Service animals do not, under law, have to have a service desk, and there is no legitimate service dog registration. There's a lot of organizations out there that will make you pay a fee to get paperwork, and those are always scams. There is no paperwork, and there is no requirement. The main one is that it's under control of the handler at all times, that it's clean, that it's housebroken, and I think that's where we get kind of into a sticky situation because anyone can go on Amazon and order a service dog vest for their animal, and the thing is when we start taking advantage of the whole service dog thing and you're using animals that are not really service dogs, you're putting a lot of people at risk. You're putting other service dogs at risk for injury. It's not good for people who actually need the service dog. So there's just a lot of issues that arise when we start just buying random vests and sticking them on our animals. Like, I love my dog. I would take her anywhere, but I would never want to take advantage of that. So.
And the service dogs that do wear vests, there's two reasons for those. One, to let the public know this is a service dog, so please do not try to pet it or handle it or talk to it. And then in another case with the woman that I worked with who used the service dog, that vest that was assigned to that dog, that that he was on duty. So that was the way the dog knew because he was still young. So when that vest was on, he knew he was on duty. And then when she got home at the end of the day, when she took it off, that's when that dog knew that he was off duty. He could go run and play and be a typical dog. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. So we will finish up a couple of these questions. This is actually, we are to the question portion. So we'd love to hear you guys ask questions. It doesn't matter if you feel like it is stupid or it is inappropriate. We love this section because this is totally an opportunity for us to educate you, the public in general. So if there's anything that you think is disrespectful, inappropriate, we will answer them all, or try to. So, all right, so Pam, hang on, we're reading yours.
And ladies, this is Charlie. I just want to throw in real quick. On the recording, when this is posted on the website, all the attendees will be anonymous. So you guys don't be afraid to have your name attached with a question later on in the future.
Awesome, awesome. Okay. No, so the question on here is, they got a form printed out from the doctor that said the dog was a support dog. That is not covered under the ADA.
No.
That could probably, maybe possibly fall under emotional support animals,
right?
Because you have the doctor's statement, but it is not, that's not covered under this federal law.
A service animal is, and it has to be performing a specific duty or task for the person, and you are allowed to ask that if it does perform a specific task or duty and what those duties are.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, we've got several people typing. I'm excited. This is always our favorite part.
We had a question at one of these too, that there was a girl who regularly comes in and out of the library, and she's nonverbal, and she's there regularly. And the library staff wondered whether or not they should recognize her and acknowledge her, say hello to her when she came in, because they did know that she did not speak. And I said, absolutely. Say hello to her or anyone else that you know that is nonverbal, just like you would greet anyone else. She knows that you're saying hello. And you might even notice like maybe a little movement or gesture in her that's showing that she's responding to your greeting.
Okay, so someone said, you know, is it possible to tell a fake service animal from the lack of training? If it acts like a pet, good odds is that it isn't actually trained to perform a service. To be honest with you, with service dogs, they should be almost undetectable. They should be so well trained and very slick and sly, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are instances like the lady that I worked with. Her service, well, she had several service dogs, but the current one was just 2 and had just come out of training. So even though they've gone through the formal training, he just started working with the owner, and so there is he's still 2 years old. So you might notice a little resistance here or there, but for the most part, yeah, they're...
Now, if someone comes into your library and they let a dog loose and it's running all over the place, then I would probably open that conversation and ask, is it a service dog? What is the need for it? What are the tasks that it can do? I think as just a word of caution, I would never assume one way or the other, but I would just know your rights as a public entity to be able to ask those questions.
Right. So the question about the gentleman who wants to volunteer, yeah, that's a tough one. I guess my question would be, is he able to communicate, 1, and then 2, has he been able to communicate abilities that he does have? That's kind of a hard one to answer.
Not knowing more
information. Not knowing, right.
Yeah. A lot of times it takes just thinking outside of the box, and that's not an easy thing to do necessarily. But it could be that he will be happy volunteering just by helping shred papers or something. So to not know what exactly he's looking for, that one would be hard to kind of give you some information or suggestions on. But, I mean, in our office, it doesn't matter how big or small. If you want to come and volunteer, we'll find something for you to do. So that one, I wish I could answer specifically, but we probably would need a little more information. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Dusting, straightening, any of those things, running a vacuum, those are always things. Again, it's thinking outside of the box. Just because this gentleman probably can't perform a paid job, just like job duty or job opening or whatever, doesn't mean that there's not some things. And he's volunteering his time, so any little thing that he could do would help, I would hope. So, he can't do any of those. Yeah.
Well, if you, like I said, if you are able to communicate with them, maybe have a conversation about things you can do. Maybe ask him, you know, around his home, if there's anything that he does around his home. Just try to be creative in your questions in order to find out what things he does do on his day-to-day.
Right. And maybe ask him if he's wanting to volunteer at the library, like, what do you see yourself doing? Maybe he's thought about that, specific things that he would want to do. So maybe he's already put some thought into that. So it is tricky whenever we talk about including people with disabilities, because you do really have to think outside of the box. Yeah, that is a great idea. And, you know, even the thing with the greeter, if he struggles with that, we do self-advocacy training, and we talk about, you know, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and just because it's a weakness doesn't mean you can't improve on it. So maybe it's uncomfortable right now, and he's stammering and not really sure about greeting people that come into the library, but that could be something that comes over time and makes them a better overall communicator, gives him confidence in something that he thought he couldn't do or he was struggling with. So there's a lot of benefits that could come out of that. So I would encourage you guys not to just put that idea to the side. Maybe work on that if that's something that he would want to do.
He could even be a greeter, like even saying like a simple hi or hello, and then like holding a sign like "Welcome to the such and such library." I mean, there's creative ways to where he could communicate a greeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I like how they're answering each other's questions too. Like they're thinking of.
That's good.
Yeah.
See, you guys didn't even need us. You guys know all this stuff before we came along. Yeah, and that's a good point. That's the whole thing about disability etiquette. It's all about educating yourself and the people that you're around. None of this stuff comes naturally to anyone. Melanie and I do this all day, every day. So this is basically our lives, I guess. So it does come naturally for us now, but at one point we struggled too.
Sure, and we are still learning. Sure, yeah.
And we'll call each other out. I mean, you know, there'll be things that we're talking about, and we're like, oh yeah, that's really politically correct, Melanie. Good use of person-first language. So, you know, we're human. We catch each other, and it's just important to be patient and to be open to this stuff. Don't be scared.
And aware.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess if we could leave you with just one point is, don't avoid interacting with someone with disabilities just because you're afraid of offending them or you think you're going to do something wrong. We just want everyone to be included in all aspects of the community.
Or if you have interacted with someone with a disability that seems to get offended, keep in mind, just like every person, disability or not, there are people who don't have very good personalities. There are people who are grumpy. So don't let an interaction like that discourage you, because it might not have even been your interaction or something you did or said. It might just be that that person just wasn't a very nice person or very happy person.
Sure.
Anyway.
And I think it is easy to see, it's easy to say sometimes that, you know, people with disabilities are just bitter and angry all the time and upset about their situation. And, you know, that really is the minority of the disability population. I think a lot of them, most of them that we've interacted with are, they've accepted that this is how their life is, and they want to overcome any barriers, and they want to be treated just like anyone else. So, so yeah, you'll get some grumpy people, but that's in every area of life.
Right.
So that large type business cards, that's awesome. We have all of our brochures are available in large print. And a lot of people, you know, kind of going back to that, assuming everyone can read Braille, most people who have come in, they can get by with our large print things. I'm thinking of a couple people coming in. So, so just because you don't have the high-tech Braille stuff or whatever doesn't mean that there's not alternatives just like that. That is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. All you that have sent us out. This has been fun.
Yeah, it has been.
Like I said, this is one of our favorite things that we do. Oh, okay.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
So print things off instead of the writing.
Yeah. See, that's another thing. Part of having a disability is doing things differently, so you're also learning how to do things a little bit differently for your patrons.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Charlie, can we wait for this last comment to come in, or?
Sure, yeah, go ahead. I know you guys want to get to everybody, and then we'll wrap up.
It would be better to wait for them to ask. Yeah, I know it's the thing, like if you see something, you naturally want to ask, but yeah, you would just, you know, greet them like you would greet anyone else. Maybe if you ask anyone, like, if there's anything I can help you with or help you find, just let me know. But if there's anything specifically that they need assistance on, yeah, they'll ask you.
I think they would be more offended by you just assuming that they couldn't do things independently. I know when Melanie started, she does have some physical, she trips a lot, we'll just say that, and so I used to run to her and try to help her up without her asking, and so she told me, hey, let me get my bearings about me, I will ask for help if I need it.
Right.
So I think that's with a physical disability or intellectual disability. I mean, obviously, if you see someone struggling, you know, you might want to come over and ask if they need assistance, just like you would with anyone without a disability. And kind of what you're saying along that line, too, not wanting to single them out. We did have a question when we did this in Bowling Green about someone who came in and they have a disability, it was a child, I think, and they were very disruptive.
Yes.
And so they weren't sure if, because they had a disability, if they could ask for them to calm down or ask them to leave. We still, while it's still a learning process for the people with disabilities and for you guys, they still have to follow the rules of the location.
Right.
You would handle that situation just like you would with a wild kid that didn't have a disability that was being disruptive.
Right.
So don't overthink it. I think a lot of times we hear that word disability or we hear service animal and we get all panicked because we worry about lawsuits or
Doing something
wrong or being offended. But people with disabilities do still have to follow rules and do still have to obey the law.
If they want to be part of society.
Yeah, correct. And so our agency is teaching that from the other end as well. So just keep that in mind too. We're not saying that they need special treatment. We just want you to be aware of things that they might need. Right. Yeah. So awesome. Well, thank you all so much. You all have been a great interactive crowd. This is the Southeast ADA Center. So I think all of you guys are in Kentucky. So if you have questions, they're trained. They've done our training on the ADA. You can give them a call about anything. If you are just not really sure about a situation that you're dealing with, if you're just not really sure about what your rights are as a public entity, you can give them a call. We have Center for Accessible Living locations in Bowling Green, Louisville, Murray, and Northern Kentucky. So if you're near one of us, you can always call us too. And if we can't answer it, we'll refer you on to the Southeast ADA. But you guys have been super interactive. We love it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Big thank you to Melanie and Lindsay. This is Charlie. I'm going to move real quickly through some closing information. And before everybody runs out of the room, I'm going to pop up a survey on your computers about today's webinar. We would love your feedback. It might cover up your webinar screen, so you can minimize it while we just move through this closing information. Today's webinar was sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and we thank them. We are on social media. Please come back and follow us. And I believe this is in your handout. You can come see some upcoming webinars we've got. And you can also now grab those handouts that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar. If you'd like to get the full-size version of today's slides and save them to your computer, you can do that. And I also put your all's contact information on there, just in case anybody had any follow-up questions for you guys.
Great.
Okay, I think that's all of the, oh, and a reminder that it was recorded. Today was recorded. So it'll be posted on our archived webinars page within about a week's time. And you can come back and review any of that information or share it with your coworkers. And big thank you to Melanie and Lindsay again for this great presentation. I'm seeing really excellent responses to the information. I know I have learned quite a bit today, so this was exactly what we were hoping it would be.
Good. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Hey, everybody, whenever you're ready to exit the webinar, just click the X in the top right-hand corner of the screen. And Melanie and Lindsay, thanks again, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.